a third in our sort of 7 sessions that we have arranged, and this one's on scientific mindset. So the previous one was on the history of organisational change, where I've done quite a bit of work on trying to plot out all the sort of key thinking and maybe where change management split from organisational development. And in that, I raised the point that by splitting from organisational development, change management kind of lost its roots in research and in scientific thinking, and sort of gone off a bit on a tangent, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And before that, I just sort of set the scene really. Back in January, I think it was, or the end of January, February, I sort of set the scene to sort of say why I thought we needed an evidence-based and more scientific approach to organisational change, change management. And I'm hoping that I'll make that case, or you'll help me make that case, because I think this is the first time really that anybody's talked about this. I think Paul Gibson wrote a book about scientific based change management, although actually I've spoken to him about this, and it doesn't contain a lot of research in it, but I think he touches the right points, and I think he's working maybe on another book. Certainly I was working with him on another book around becoming a bit more scientific about change management. There are other schools of thought. From Adam Grant's book came out, Think Again, last year, still available in hardback, not available in softback yet, which is all about how we can change our mindset around thinking more scientifically. And I think there are people in the UK as well who are leading on this, CIPD and Rob Breener as well, who's sort of leading with creating more sort of evidence-based, and I use that as a sort of scientific-based mindset. So that's the kind of frame, or my sort of ontology or epistemology for talking about this today. So let's get on with the presentation. So I don't know. I was always told that I should talk a little bit about myself at the beginning of presentations, and I don't like talking about my work particularly. I'm an organisational change manager, just like the rest of you guys, and we all know what it's about, and we all know what our frustrations are day to day with it. I like to talk about the more exciting part of my career, which is my sort of free diving career. And the reason I'm using free diving, and I'm trying to change free diving for every session that I do, my interpretation of free diving, because it actually seems to work as a good analogy for most things, is that, when I was training people put their trust in me, and, I have to bring them back. They dive to 10 meters, they dive to 20 meters, and I have to bring them back to the surface safely. As change managers, we go into organizations, don't we? And we promise something, we promise, to help them with their change, and hopefully help them recover and get back to the surface if they're drowning. And that process, I think, has to be based in a scientific method. It has to be based in some evidence. We have to be confident in the causal claims that we make. When I'm advertising my services as a free diving instructor, I have to be able to say, you won't die. I mean, otherwise I'm not going to get a lot of custom. And I have to prove that I'm qualified. And I have to prove that my qualification is based on something. And in fact, it wasn't that long ago that freediving actually wasn't based on anything, and people just literally made it up. And it was based on fads like eating lots of garlic, because that'll get your heart rate down, which saves oxygen, which means you can hold your breath for longer. Blueberries are an antioxidant, so when you've got high levels of CO2 in your blood after you've held your breath for a while, you get lots of lots of bad stuff in your bloodstream. And people thought, well, we'll eat lots of blueberries because that'll act as an antioxidant. I've even seen blueberries as a cure for COVID when it first started as well. So there were lots of weird and wonderful techniques, and then scientists started to get involved, and people who were actually studying science started free diving, started to do proper research into this stuff. And now, if you go on a free diving course, it is all about the science, and it is absolutely fascinating. We have a mammalian dive reflex, and we can dive just like any other mammal and hold our breath, and we have the same reaction in our body, although we can't dive to 100 meters and hold our breath for 10 minutes. So it is fascinating. And I think that journey, that scientific side of free diving, is a lot more interesting than people running around making stuff up. because then it's just my opinion versus your opinion, and that becomes, you know, quite sort of personal and subjective, and it just becomes an ideology and not a discipline. So there you go. I've laid out my argument in the first 6 minutes of this session. So I realised actually, whilst I was going through this presentation, there's a bit of maybe a bit of a bottom fetish coming out here, because I talk a lot about enemas, and I hadn't realised that until I started going through the slides. But the reason for including this was, you know, science has come a long way, and people just literally, like Freedom, just used to make it up, didn't they? You know, you take cocaine, give it to your children to stop their toothache. We used to give electric shocks to people who had hysteria, whatever hysteria is. I imagine it was mainly women who were getting hysteria in those days, and this was you know, a way of men controlling women with this electric, you can see this electric device here that you'd put against the temple and blast, maybe blast your wife with it or something, and it would calm her down. And then you had a sort of then there was all that sort of, I guess, fairly unscientific approach. Sorry, if people could put themselves on mute, that'd be great, because I've just got a little bit of background there. And there's this picture of the 1960s doctor who was probably educated. If he was, you know, 60 in the 1960s, he probably went to college 40 years before that and studied methods that were from the 1800s. And if he wasn't reading journals and he wasn't reading any evidence of what worked or what didn't work, and he was just relying on his own practice, then he was probably caught in some sort of practice loop. He was just doing things because, sorry, I'm going to put people on, how do I put people on mute? Put everybody on mute. I'm going to mute notifications. How do I put people on? Oh, it seems to stop now anyway. Okay, good. And even now, doctors don't read up on the latest evidence. You know, we know there's been research conducted, and actually, the older the doctor is, the less likely it is that they will read the latest evidence. And this is also touched on in Adam Grant's book as well, that he's saying that as we get older, we get, you know, stuck in our habitual ruts, and it's more difficult for us to change. And there is a story here, and I probably don't have time to tell it, around using enemas on women who had pregnancies. So you've got male doctors, you know, prescribing enemas to women during pregnancy to stop them sort of defecating when they were giving birth. And this was seen as being a big health hazard. And it wasn't actually until the 1990s, the late 1990s, that a randomized controlled trial was conducted that actually found out there was no benefit of giving women enemas at all during childbirth. So this is men prescribing something to women that's very humiliating, very distressing, very painful, that had no effect at all. And I guess coming back to organisational change, this is one of the questions that I have around organisational change, is if we're not evidencing what we're doing, and we don't really understand what we're doing because there is no evidence, we're not using a scientific mindset, then how do we know that we're not causing more harm than good? And our own bias and our own prejudice is just coming into play as to what we think should be done or shouldn't be done. Actually, that study was done under 665 women in 2000. So that's actually quite recent, which always shocks and surprises me. And people always ask, I've seen people on Rob Breener's sessions on evidence-based management, people always ask, so why, you know, what's the benefit? And I came across this study, which was conducted in 2020, which was amongst entrepreneurs who were taught a scientific approach to problem solving. And that was, you can see here, you know, framing what the problem was, identifying it, validating what the problem is, formulating falsifiable hypothesis. You know, hypotheses can actually be tested. There are lots of things that we can probably want to go out and check, but if we can't actually test them in reality, then there's no point in conducting an experiment. Using the right measures, etc., etc. And they found, you know, you can see the blue line there, which are the guys who were educated in an evidence-based approach to their decision making, completely outstripped the entrepreneurs that didn't in terms of revenue. And I thought this was quite a nice sort of hard piece, but again, very recent bit of research, and there needs to be lots more understanding around what works and what doesn't work. And actually, there's our own view of entrepreneurs is that they just kind of make it up as they go, and they just try things. And but in fact, the entrepreneurs that take their time, consider and study the data are the most successful. Sorry, my second bottom reference was this term blowing smoke up our own arses. So I know it's a bit crude, but when we go into clients, we want to satisfy them, we want to make them happy, and at the end of the day, we run the risk of just telling them what they want to hear, which is the term blowing smoke up their arses. And when I researched this, I actually found that this is actually something that used to be done to people who were unconscious. Doctors or any random person. This was actually discovered by a guy who blew smoke up his wife's bottom while she was laying unconscious on the beach, and she came around. And apparently people thought, oh well, tobacco is this amazing stimulant that can get people, and so it was used extensively in medicine. Don't really know how it worked. It could have been embers burning their bottom. It could have been the stimulation of the tobacco. But that's where the phrase comes from. And sometimes I feel if we're not having an evidence-based approach, scientific approach, very crudely, this is kind of what we're doing. We're just using stuff that just kind of makes people happy and seems to work in the moment. But we have no real justification for why we're doing it. And when we discover something that seems to work and we have a huge impact, and everybody pats us on the back and we've had a great positive impact on the organisation, then we sort of shoot up this confidence curve. We become very confident in what we're doing in our practice based on a very small sample size. And Dunning and Kruger did there's a lot of research into this effect, that when we start learning, we become incredibly confident and incredibly sort of think we become incredibly knowledgeable very quickly, because we're shooting up this learning curve. And then we reach a point where we're like, oh, hang on a minute, this is a bit more complicated than I thought it was. And then you come into this sort of valley of despair. It looks a bit like the Kubler-Ross curve, doesn't it? Come into this valley of despair where you're struggling through the complications, and then there's the scope of enlightenment, which is like this is actually a lot more difficult. I'm going to be a bit more humble about my understanding of change management or whatever discipline it is. And by going through that sort of humbleness, you start to become more competent, and you're absorbing more because you're more open to learning. And then you get to this sort of plateau of sustainability when you sort of retire or you become a guru. So that's the sort of science behind it. So that's me sort of laying out the case. So today's session is really, going a little bit deeper into those points. What do we mean by science? So hopefully that won't be too dull. What is the problem that we're trying to solve here? Why can't we just carry on doing what we're doing? And then I just wanted to get a little bit into the neuroscience and why we believe what we believe. So what is it that gets us stuck in these habitual ruts, or believing that we're right kind of at all costs? And then how do myth beliefs come about? So how does all this stuff potentially that we believe in come about? If it doesn't work, or there's no evidence that it works, then why is it so ingrained in our practice? And then what can we do about it? And this is just a slide just to say how important I think all this stuff is. We've got to change. The world is in danger, and if there isn't a stronger call to action to go out and help organisations fundamentally change the way that they operate, to meet carbon neutral targets or whatever it is, or even fundamentally us as individuals, we see in the US, we see around the world, just polarizing of views. If this isn't the right time to learn how we can appreciate and understand different points of view and change our perspective on things, then I don't think there's going to be a better time. So what do we mean by science? And this is just something that I got. This is the Science Council, seems to be a reputable place to go to get a definition. And it's the pursuit and application of knowledge at the end of the day. It's not about necessarily running really hardcore controlled trials in laboratories and fiddling around with chemicals and stuff. It's about fundamentally, it's about building our knowledge and understanding our world better, but in some sort of systematic way. And we'll talk about that. When we talk about systematic, it doesn't have to be in a laboratory. It doesn't have to be in a controlled environment necessarily, and particularly in organisational change. And this is something that I've posted about what's the difference between art and science. And I think, the whole idea of reinterpreting the way that we see the world is in fact art, is artistry. A piece of, you go into a gallery and you look at a piece of art, and it's about challenging the way that you view the world. And kind of that's what, for me, is what science is about. So this distinction between art and science, I think, is potentially unhelpful. And I think somebody posted, I think it was Rob Breener, sort of posted, well, actually, they're the same, there's no point in distinguishing between them, because scientific things use experimentation, and art uses experimentation, and art uses maths, and artistic things are used in science as well. We have to use our imagination, we have to use our creativity. So trying to define these two things, and in fact, you'll see the poll, you probably can't see the poll at the bottom, but it was, the majority of people felt that we have to understand organisational change as an art and a science. And I won't go through this list of the difference between the two, but we have to use our intuition, and we have to use our logic, we have to use our experience, and we have to use evidence. And this is the whole point of evidence-based practices, that we combine all these different sources of evidence. So we don't want to be a Spock or a Kirk. We want to be a what I call a Spurk. The sort of the love child of those two. And this is I guess the sort of the boring bit, but for me, it's absolutely critical. I think that organisational change, for me, doesn't really have an ontology. It doesn't really have a grounding in how we should be selecting what we believe in. So how do we challenge? If someone says, "I believe in the Kubler-Ross curve," how do we challenge that? Because if we challenge it with science, or I've challenged people with science, well, this doesn't exist, and then people say, well, all models are wrong, and we'll go into that. So that kind of thing wouldn't be acceptable in the world of science, in neuroscience or in biology or in physics. If you said, well, all models are wrong, but someone said, well, but this was wrong 90% of the time, and it would be thrown out. But no, we keep it in organisational change. So, and then the second thing is the epistemology. So how do we organise that? So we agree on what is knowledge and what isn't. How do we organise it, which is the epistemology, and then what methods do we use then to sort of view that knowledge? So we say, right, this is some knowledge, let's go out and test it. How do we do that? Do we run a survey? Do we do a case study? Do we do some action research? Do we do some quasi-experimentation? And then how do we then keep on repeating and testing that? What methods do we use to keep on repeating and testing that? And for me, this isn't in place, and this is what I'm trying to do through my posts through LinkedIn and everything, is just trying to figure out what criteria we should be using to build this body of knowledge. And this isn't new. People have been saying it since the 1940s, that we need to build a body of evidence, and this is more around, I guess, organisational development, although now we see Kurt Lewin as talking about organisational change as well, because a lot of the theories are taken from that, rightly or wrongly. And I love this, the best road to know truth, even in such a delicately and intricate area as human relationships. And for some of the arguments that I hear are, well, human relationships are somehow above science, that we can't really understand science, can't really understand human relationships through science. And I don't understand what that means or why that is, and it'd be interesting if somebody has those views. And this idea from Kurt Lewin, so we have to build constructs, and this is quite an early idea. We have to build constructs in organisational development or organisational change, and we'll talk about what a construct is, and that those constructs should be tested, continuously tested. He's talking about using mathematical, and they are mathematical in nature, and it's very interesting when you read Lewin's stuff and seeing all the equations in there, just how far he went with all of that, which is fascinating. And then you've got Jay Forrester, who talks about you know, if we just go into organisations and we're just randomly testing stuff that comes into our mind or is based on our own experience, then those lessons can't be transferred because we don't understand under what conditions they were valid or invalid, because we're not applying a scientific mindset. So that knowledge is then lost, which is such a shame, because we're all practicing this stuff. It's been practiced for the last 40, 50 years or whatever, and yet if we haven't got anything to hook it onto, then it's lost. So I just thought I would throw this up in terms of the art science thing and what we mean by a construct. And my interpretation of this drawing, this is not a pipe, is that it isn't a pipe. It's a drawing of a pipe. So what makes a pipe a pipe? And please go into the chat. I haven't got my chat open. Sorry, I'll open my chat. Please go into the chat and tell me why. Please tell me why this isn't a pipe. And it's not a pipe because we define things by what they do and how we can how they feel in our hands. So if a pipe if we can't smoke through a pipe, or if we can't touch it and feel the smoothness of the wood, or we can't tap it on our teeth and feel the plastic end, then it's not a pipe. So we define things. We divide lots of observations. We group them together into what we call constructs. And so Deborah Campbell said there are so many variables in human relationships. The loss of so many variables cannot create the same conditions to us. Okay, great. Thanks, Deborah. We'll come on to that. Edwina, you've said, which is why the application of scientific research is so limited. Yeah, are you replying to Deborah's point, Edwina? Yeah. So we have this idea of constructs, and how do we build these constructs? So the constructs are important because they become a common language. When we're talking about organisational fairness or organisational justice or trust in leadership, we have a construct, we have a definition of what it is. So we have a definition of what it is, we have a bunch of measures, we know how to measure it. So we can all start talking the same language. If we're just making stuff up, then obviously we literally don't know what we're talking about, because we don't have a common definition, we don't have a bunch of data that supports what that thing is, we don't have a consistent way of measuring it. And I just thought that this was an interesting article on construct validity, written by the person who assesses whether things go into the Academy of Management Review, and he was saying that this is what I think a construct is, and it's it's got to have a clear definition. So in change management, when ADKAR talk about it's the people side of change, what does that mean? All organisations have people in them. Organisations can't affect change, systems can't fix change. It's only humans that could. So where do we go with that? How does that help us? And it just becomes a tautology. It's sort of circular. Okay, so it doesn't take us very far. So the definitions need to be, very clear language, scope and of what we're talking about, and space and time. So when we talk about Kubler-Ross is obviously an extrapolation from grief counselling. So what's its application? Why are we extrapolating something from another discipline into our discipline? Kotter, time. Why are we wouldn't use a mobile phone that was designed in 1992 to communicate now. So why are we using Kotter's 8 steps, which hasn't changed? Why are we using them to solve 21st century problems when it's written in the 20th century? And also the constructs are not islands. Someone's thought of this stuff before, so we should always, or something similar or something preceding it that you're then building on the shoulders of great thinkers. So we should always be looking for, okay, so where does this come from? Things don't just come out of the blue. And so again, with Kotter and ADKAR, it's difficult because we don't know what underpins their thinking, because there's no references in either of those books to any academic research, apart from ADKAR, who do refer to motivation theory, but that's kind of it. They're based on case studies, and they're not even referenced either. And then we've got coherence. So once we've got the clear definition, scope, relationship, then that creates a coherent construct. We all know what we're talking about. We know what the background is. We know what the epistemology is. We know where it fits with everything else, and we can start building on that idea and testing the hypothesis of that construct exists or not. So that's what we mean by a construct. And in 2001, these guys, Pettigrew, sort of did this examination of change management and where he thought it was. And this is, 20 years ago. And he was saying, that it sort of lacks context, and it lacks any understanding of complexity of context. So people are coming out with one size fits all type solutions to problems without understanding the context. So he's saying, he's challenging academics in change management and practitioners as well to say, look, we need to understand how context affects change more. We need to understand the time and history. So what's the prior history of the organisation? And then when we run an intervention, how does that impact over time? And it's so difficult for academics, I think, or anybody to go into an organisation, even as a practitioner. You're lucky, if you get a 6-month contract, you get a year contract, you'd be lucky to see maybe a lot of change around your intervention. So again, there's that, how do we track the success of interventions over time? And then there's this link between change performance. So is what we're doing actually solving the problem or improving performance? So that's sort of causal claim that we're all selling. And the sort of pacing and readiness. I mean, the change readiness literature is very confused. I mean, we've been working on it. People have been working on it for sort of 20 years or so, and there isn't a clear sort of approach to that, and even trying to define it. And so, yeah, that's another challenge. And then ultimately working, practitioners and scholars working together. So how can that work even better? So they were their challenges, and the challenges that I get when I talk about organisational evidence-based practice and organisational changes. It's just theories. It's just talking about theories here. Well, there is a clear definition for what a theory is, and a theory is something that explains a bunch of facts. A theory is something that explains a construct. So actually, it's not just something we pluck out of the air. It's something that's rooted in research. All models are wrong, but some are useful, and that came from George Box, who wrote that in 1976. And in 1987, he was challenged on that and said, well, it's not very helpful. And he rephrased it to say, remember that all models are wrong. Okay, so nothing actually is a reflection of reality, because if it was, then we would have cracked the code of life. So all models are wrong from that respect. But then the second half of his question was, the practical question is, how wrong do they have to be not to be useful? So at what point are you going to drop one of your ideas because it's no longer useful? And how would we know it's no longer useful? So if you know that the Kubler-Ross is wrong 90% of the time, when are we going to drop that? How wrong does it have to be? Does it have to be 99% wrong? Does it have to be 100% wrong all the time? And in evidence-based management, we say, well, things have got to be at least right 50% of the time. Otherwise, we're just flipping a coin. So in fact, we say that things should be right, more than 60% of the time, and then you have different grades according to the likelihood of an intervention working. And that's the way that evidence-based management sort of categorises research as well. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I had a long debate about this as well, and I wrote a whole article about it. And the point here is that if there isn't a baby, then it's fine to throw the bathwater out, because there isn't a baby. There isn't something worth holding on to potentially with these theories. And I challenged the whole idea of that as well. It seemed very anyway. And change management is not science, it's an art. We talked about that, and yeah, it's a combination of both. The organisations are complex, and so we can't find causality in them. Well, people do a lot of work on causality. We have climate change, we have weather predictions for at least sort of 5 years. You know, people do make predictions, complex systems, and they are highly predictable. They can be highly predictable because they have lots of feedback loops in them. We just need to be able to observe the patterns that they're showing us, which is obviously difficult if we've got our own mindset around what's going on. And hard and soft science, even scientists don't agree necessarily how to measure hard and soft science. I've seen papers around hard science saying, well, hard science is defined as the ones that have lots of graphs in it. You know, and we don't produce lots of graphs in change management, and we don't use a lot of hard data, so it's not a hard science. I don't even know necessarily what hard or soft science means necessarily. All I do know is that the more robust research we have, the harder I think our science becomes, and the more diligently you know, we do our research. Sorry, Edwina, you're writing things in here, and I thank you very much. I'm just worried that I'm. So, any reflections on that? There you go. Let's reflect on that. So, Edwina, you go. Tell me what you've written in the.
So I had two thoughts as you were going through it. I captured in the chat. The first one was, I think you're right. I think environment and context really matter. I think as humans there is a natural bias to the future, the solution, because that's the way things are driven at. And actually you need to look back. History matters, context matters, and environment matters. And we just don't spend enough time taking those into account. I think you're right. There is a high level of predictability that can come from that. I also think that it matters at an organisation and an individual level. And then my second one was really, and I know you often say Kubler-Ross doesn't work. We use it. But when I say we use it, before you shoot me down, we use it in a very, very specific way, which is to train change agents of the emotions that they might face and give them the right tactics to respond to. We don't use it in a way that says every human is going to go through these stages in this sequence, in this timing, and at 3:30 on a Wednesday, you're going to hit anger. So I think a lot of it is how you use it. And I think that the human need to pattern and systemize things, which makes our lives easier. I think we push models too far. We lose context of what they're there for, and we take them way out of what they're designed for. And I think most people who design a model would be horrified at the way it's been applied. I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Sabrina. Any other thoughts, reflections? You're getting lots of claps there, Edwina. Good. Okay. Thank you. So this one is this section is on. So you know, what's the problem? So what's the problem if we don't apply science, or you know? And I posted recently about solutioneering. Seems to be quite popular. I didn't actually do that much because I just regurgitated systems thinking approach to solutioneering because I was listening to Rob Breener talk about solutioneering. But people got quite excited about it, and I quite like the idea that we have a problem because we don't have a solution. You know, that's the problem. We don't have, you know, and you see that in organisations, don't you? Say, well, that organisation's doing an engagement survey. Well, why aren't we doing one? That organisation's doing conscious bias training. You know, they're doing interventions around psychological safety. Why aren't we doing that stuff? You know, and that's clearly the wrong place to start. You know, that you're just going out looking for something sexy to do, or something you're just following what other people are doing rather than understanding your own context. Edwina, your point. So so they're kind of stuck at this level really, where we're just sort of observing stuff that's going off, maybe in other organisations, maybe in our organisation, and we're just sort of knee-jerking and just saying, oh my God, how did that happen? Let's do something like you know, there was an incident of somebody you know, sexually harassing somebody. Well, let's do some conscious bias training. There you go. That will sort that out. So, but in fact, if the conscious bias training we know from evidence potentially doesn't work, and you know, potentially could make things worse. It could make situations more awkward potentially, and so then we have another problem, and we just keep on going, and we're just creating more problems as we go. And the idea is that, you know, if we can sit back and think about, and I try to map my previous slide to this, that what are the values that we want from organisational change. We want to be reputable, don't we? We want to have reliable interventions, and so they're my values. That's my strategic direction. That's my sort of fundamental belief, I guess, and on ontology of what I think should be valid. That something should be valid if we can prove its impact. That we challenge our mental models. So we have to challenge our assumptions, which is how we're sort of organising our knowledge, and we need to better understand interrelationships, so the structures, so the way that we are applying our methods, the way that we're structuring our work creates certain patterns, and so we have to be aware of that as well. And those structures create certain patterns. So if we go into organisations and we say, our methodology is Cotter, and we start off with a sense of urgency, and we go into an organisation and create a sense of urgency, then the patterns of behaviour there could be panic and stress. And so we, as obviously change agents or organisational change practitioners, affect the environment as well. But I'm also saying that this is a way that organisations need to think more holistically and systematically, that they should be thinking about their values and their mental models. And I know this is incredibly difficult to do, but this is fundamentally, I think, where we've got to get to if we're going to understand complex systems and apply systems thinking. And my Mythbusters, again, I just went through and challenged these, and I quite like. I was watching Ricky Gervais talking about, if you know him, he's a comedian, and he was talking about the existence of God, and I thought this is quite a nice analogy that in organisational change, if we didn't have all of these myths, say if we didn't have learning styles, for example, would they be recreated? If somebody way back, if Lewin hadn't said that we go in and freeze, unfreeze, change, and then refreeze, if he hadn't said that, would that still be part of our repertoire as change? And the thing about science, and I'm not being anti-religious, but the thing about science is that information stays with us forever. Whereas the difference between art and faith and belief is that the stories can change, can't they? And we can all interpret them how we want to. But science doesn't change. If we hadn't discovered the atom, or whatever it is, 100 years ago, we'd have discovered it 50 years ago, we'd have discovered it 25 years ago. The facts remain. And I think this for me is quite an important point around the myth-busting challenge, and what we believe is that in order to be sustainable, it's got to be based on a robust sort of scientific logic, and maybe that will create some debate as well. If we're just making stuff up, it'll just disappear. It'll come and go. Fads come and go. And I think this is where we are with our body of knowledge at the moment. I think that potentially there's a pretense of knowledge based on this sort of delusion of rigorous research and anecdotal evidence, and this is taken from Goshal's paper in 2005, which talks about management training destroying management practices, because people are going out of organisations being trained in management sort of science, which isn't based on science, and then going in and using those practices, and that's actually undermining teamwork or undermining management practice. And potentially the same thing is happening with change management. People go out on a change management course, and then they go into an organisation, and because it's not based on the science, it's not based on research, they're actually potentially doing more damage. So one example of this is, brain take change, for instance. If you're taught that, then you go into an organisation with a negative viewpoint, excessive truth claim. You've got poor quality theories, and that creates this sort of behaviour that actually we've got to tackle resistance. Resistance is the first thing that we go into, and when you apply for jobs, or if you do ADCAR, the resistance plan is there, and if you go for a job interview, you'll be asked, how do you manage resistance? And this creates a self-perpetuating, I think, sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that people do resist change, and I'd like to change that. I think if we have beliefs that are based more objectively, and we're constantly testing, and we're staying in this state of questioning our assumptions, then our truth claims are based on the best available knowledge at the moment. That might change, and that's fine, and I'm open to challenge. My assumptions are constantly being revised, hopefully based on new evidence that's coming to light, which even doctors aren't very good at. And my behaviour is then taken into an organisation where we want to create an experimental learning environment for people to change. That's how we think people change, based on the evidence. So my mindset actually is already helping the organisation change. And I think that's, anyway, okay, I think that's fairly fundamental. Any reflections on that? Have I said anything out of kilter?
I'm with you. I don't believe humans hate change. I think we hate surprises, but I don't think we hate change.
No.
And my test of that one is do any of your employees use a mobile phone?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you can use a mobile phone and you're downloading the latest apps and you're ordering takeaway food, believe me, you can change. It's not a case of ability, it's a case of willingness. And very few of the models actually look enough at willingness over ability. Anyway. Yeah. So you're right.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, and I'll talk about the neuroscience of change as well. That most of the research in neuroscience is on stress, and so when you again apply neuroscience research into organisational change, it's all based on this negative reaction, and there's very little research into surprise and curiosity and novelty. There's more of it coming out now, but it's only been happening for the last sort of five years or so. So yeah.
The most toxic thing, I think you've said a couple of times now, is to go into any organisation and create crisis. I just think is one of the most toxic things you can possibly do, because people spot it a mile away and you just lose your credibility immediately. And the last thing you need is for people to be firing off their systems and their, threat systems going off, and all they're going to do is clam up, and you've lost trust and safety. It's like the most poor attempt you can possibly do, unless there is a genuinely life-threatening crisis, and very few organisations have that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you.
Thanks, Edwina. Any other reflections? I'm curious, is it possible to account for bias in human behaviour which hinders change? Maybe at the next reflection, Ida, you could raise that and we could explore that, but I think maybe I'll address that in this next section. Yeah, I posted about how we form our beliefs, and I'll just touch a little bit on the neuroscience now. Maybe this will answer your question, Ida, about our biases. But our beliefs are based on our logic. We do top-down logic where we see things outside and we try and deduce what they mean. We also project onto our environment as well, which is sort of bottom-up inductive reasoning, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We obviously use our intuition, our sort of gut feeling, which is sort of our bias and heuristics that come from years of experience. They don't just sort of magic their ways into our lives, but we're less in control of them, I guess. And then there's the sort of evidence which can come from, again, our own experience that we're sort of conscious of. It can come from internally within an organisation, their customer satisfaction surveys or whatever it is. It could come from academic research. And then we have what I call the systems here, which are the things that we surround ourselves with, books by Adam Grant, or podcasts that we listen to, or videos that YouTube that we watch, the people that we surround ourselves with, the system that we are affected by for form our beliefs. This seems to be a best approximation of how we form beliefs. So we start off with, so I'm saying here, there's this sort of reality here. This is this sort of matrix in the top right-hand corner, that network, and that's an organisation. And we have our beliefs, our knowledge and experience, which kind of gives us a fairly, limited view of what's going on in that organisation. We haven't been there before. So we have a bunch of current beliefs. And that's this sort of very wide probability distribution here that what we think is actually what is happening. And then we go away, hopefully, and we don't just jump straight into what we think is going on and jump straight into a solution. We go away and we do a bit of reading and we talk to people, stakeholders, and we start to form more detailed opinion of what's going on in the organisation. And that gives us a tighter, potentially more accurate view of sort of what's going on. And that's what's called our sort of that's new evidence. That's and then we form a new belief, which is a new mental model of the way that organisation works. And hopefully that combination of our intuition and our experience and all the research and what's going on in our organisation forms a pretty accurate view of what's going on, and then we can come up with an intervention. And this is called Bayesian. This is called, the technical word for this is Bayesian updating. It's used in neuroscience, and this is how they think our brains work in terms of how we keep on building our mental models of what a pipe is, what a light is, what organisational change is. So we're constantly updating our beliefs using this process. And obviously we can reject stuff, new evidence, we reject it. And this is one of the problems, is that our current beliefs are so strong that we actually select information that supports our current beliefs. And I'll come on to that, which is where all these bias and heuristics come from, is that we would just, if we read an academic piece of research and it tells us the opposite of what we've believed in for the last 20 years, the likelihood is that we'll throw it out. And I love this video, which is just, I always envisage this as two people having an argument and coming to, and this is Bayesian updating. This is a model using a very simple formula, which is sort of bringing two viewpoints together. So you could view this as a dialogue. You could view this as your beliefs over time as you get more evidence, and you can see how they come closer and closer together. And this is sort of like a simulation of how they think the brain sort of forms beliefs. And this is just something I posted the other day because I'm really getting into this at the moment. And this is a process of active inference. So we're not just passive observers. We do passively, we observe and we take information based on sight, sound, touch, whatever it is. And that feeds into our sort of current beliefs. And then we form a new belief. Oh, okay, so kettle's hot when I touch it. Form a new belief, kettles are always hot, and then I go out and test that, and I touch other kettles and see if they're hot, and then find out that some are cold sometimes when they haven't been turned on or whatever it is. So we form this process, this constant loop of learning, but it is biased by what we want to see, and actually we become sort of self-fulfilling prophecies, is that we surround ourselves with stuff and information that supports our view of the world. And the reason we do that is because it minimises the amount of energy it takes to understand our world. As you said, Edwina, we form models of the world, and we're constantly seeking information that supports our view of the world. And that's really dangerous for being scientifically minded or evidence-based, is that we've actually going to put ourselves into fairly uncomfortable positions and challenge ourselves and let other people challenge us. So that's that, and I'll be going into more of that on in the neuroscience piece. So just quickly push on. And I'm sure there'll be I'm hoping there'll be lots of questions at the end of this. My slides are still working. So I thought this was an interesting way of how fads and fictions come about, and I'm using fixed mindset, growth mindset as an example of this. That somebody does a cautionary piece of research. The journalist gets hold of it and goes, "Oh my God! If everybody adopted growth mindset, we'd all be outperforming and be amazing." And then someone writes some catchy, book or phrase about it, and they go and do a TED talk, and then before you know it, consultants are selling it. And then the academics say, "Well, hang on a minute, we've just done 10 years of research now into this, and we found it doesn't actually give the benefits that we thought it did." And then everybody starts sort of backtracking, and they move on to the next fad. And this is what's happened. This is what's happened with certainly with growth mindset, where people have actually based their whole consultancy practices on it. and the impact of growth mindset on performance is very minimal. And it's been dropped by lots of schools as well, which is originally sort of designed for. Another example is the n-step change models that we have. So, you know, they're built on, as I said, the lack of evidence, Cotter and Adcar, but others as well. They're out of date. They were written a long time ago. They're using extraordinary extrapolations, which we mentioned, you know, with Kubler-Ross again. But neuroscience is another extraordinary extrapolation. People have written books on the neuroscience of organisational change, for instance. And then we have, you know, fairly gloomy visions. I mentioned, you know, it's fairly gloomy, the stuff that you read about, you know, resistance to change and brains hate change and that sort of stuff, and it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And the n-step models, you know, they're top down, and we know that organisations can't operate like that. If they want to be agile and respond to change, we've got to have more autonomous units who are closer to the voice of the customer, or whatever. They're very project-based, so they're very linear. They're episodic, and we know that, you know, change is more emergent, and they're closed systems, they're closed loops as well. And as Abwina was saying, again, we've been talking about, you know, we're open systems. Organisations are constantly reacting to different things that are going on. So the question is, you know, are they really suitable for today's environment? And 53% of people said no. 38% of people said bits of them. So then the question is, well, what bits? Because you talk to people about, well, I carry all these models of change in my head, and there are over 50 of them. I carry all of those, and then I just take bits of them and apply them to whatever I'm dealing with. And so how do you know which bits to apply when, and how do you hold 50 models in your head? And the idea of this matrix was really just to show, well, these are the bits that potentially do or don't work from these few selected models that I took. And actually, there is already a nice bit of research, I thought, that just sort of lays out organisational change in these 10 steps. So if you only need to hold one model, I think, in your head, which is if you follow these 10 steps, it pretty much incorporates all the bits that we know that work from all the other models that are out there. And I think organisational change needs more of this. We need more of this integration, pulling all this stuff together and validating exactly what works and what doesn't work. And this is the point of construct validity. So here we are talking about creating a sense of urgency, which I mentioned quite a lot. And you see at least 5 different definitions of what it is, all the way from it's difficult to make much progress of a major change effort unless most managers obviously believe that there is that the current status quo is unacceptable. So that's Cotter. And then we have Phillips in 1993 saying it's a strong, widespread felt need for change. Direction of change is not yet clear, so, you know, a feeling of change. Emotional stir-up comes from Lewin and Cotter, and then you get the more hardcore stuff from Shen, which is you have to destroy attitudes, create a sense of urgency to destroy attitudes. And then you get Connor, who talks about orchestrating pain within organisations. So when we talk about creating a sense of urgency, I'm kind of all with, oh, business as usual isn't okay. That's fine. Yeah, if that's what you mean by creating a sense of urgency, that's fine. Let's tell people or get people to recognise that business as usual isn't fine. Hopefully they won't panic, but they'll think about it. But orchestrating pain is something completely different. So this is what I mean about construct validity and being very clear on what we mean, is that we literally don't know what we're talking about, even something as fundamental as this. And these are some steps for spotting a dodgy concept. So I'm going to whiz through the last part, so we have at least half an hour to chat about this stuff. So this is what we mean by evidence-based practice, and this was developed with CIPD, with the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. So if you look up Centre for Evidence-Based Management, there's loads of, you can sign up, and there's loads of research, and it's a really good resource, and there's loads of training, and you can become qualified online. But basically, they say, in order to stop this bias, in order to adopt a more scientific mindset, we need to look at these 4 sources of information when we go into an organisation. This is not just organisational change. This applies to, HR practice as well, or any sort of management practice. And then we go through these 6 simple steps. So we ask the question, we define what the question is that we're trying to answer. What is the problem? And you remember those entrepreneurs, they were given a scientific approach to running their business, and this is pretty much the same. You go out, you acquire information, systematically appraise the information according to whether it's relevant, whether it's the right context, whether the study is robust enough, whether the sample size, say, is big enough. And then you aggregate all of that together, and then you sort of apply it, and you come up with some interventions, and then you apply the interventions, and then you assess them, and then you go back. This is not a linear process, it's a loop. You just go back to asking, okay, did it work? It didn't work. Let's fine tune it. And there are, I won't go into this, but there are different sources of evidence that are sort of ranked. This is not really used anymore because it all depends on what you're using the evidence for. So if you're asking a how question, you use different sources of evidence than if you're asking a sort of a what question. And I can go through this in more detail if people are interested, but I'll skip over this. But it's just sort of saying what kind of evidence you will use at different stages of that evidence-based process. So what is the question that I'm trying to answer? You might use consultancy reports, you might use sort of expert opinions, you might use some qualitative studies within the organisation. One team is, struggling with certain issues. So, potentially it's a bit more anecdotal. You're trying to feel your way around. And then once you've got an idea, then you might go out to some more robust academic research and say, well, we seem to be having a problem with psychological safety. All the internal research is telling us that. What does the research say? In what kind of circumstances this exists, and what kind of interventions can we use? So you use different types of information according to the different questions that you're asking. So case studies are very good, for example, for asking the how question. So how am I going to implement this intervention? And a case study is really good for that because it gives you a detailed account of the steps that someone went through to run an intervention and potential issues. And this is Adam Grant's book, where he's sort of saying, we should be adopting a more scientific mindset. So these are some top tips for us in terms of how we can become more scientific in our approach, and that's to stop this overconfidence cycle, that that curve that I showed you at the beginning, how we don't shoot up the sort of that curve too quickly in terms of our confidence. And it's really pride that stops us from admitting that we're wrong. It's conviction that we believed in stuff for a long time. We've been practicing it for a long time, and somebody who taught us it we really liked a lot, and they wouldn't tell us things that weren't true. That our own confirmatory bias. Well, I've seen it in real life. I've used this and I've seen it happen. And the desirability bias. I really want this to be true, so I just selectively look for evidence, which is and what Adam Grant's saying is we should get more into the rethinking, which is humility. Just laughing about when we're wrong. We just it's interesting, and being curious, and treating everything as a journey of discovery, and questioning, doubting ourselves. Obviously, not too much. And I kind of like this distinction between hating being wrong. So if you're in overconfidence, you hate being wrong, you do whatever it is to prove that you're right. But actually, we want to get into a mindset where we love being less wrong. So we can be wrong, that's fine. But if Edwina tells me I'm wrong and provides me with the evidence, then I'm just less wrong than I was before, which is great. Which means I'm learning. So anyway. Just a nice shift, I thought. And Adam Grant also, incidentally, wrote about the importance of using quasi-experimentation in organisations. So it's, Lewin invented the idea of action research. So you go into organisations and you use research to stimulate change. And the quasi-experiment is sort of actually experimenting on an organisation, not to stimulate change, but to find out some facts. And what he's sort of saying is, well, why don't we combine these two? Why don't we run change as an experiment? We don't really know potentially what the solution is. So let's run a trial, and we can have one team in one country running with this performance management method and another team running with this performance management method, or not running one at all. And that could be our control, or we run as an intervention in one place of psychological safety and not in another. And we try and normalise for other effects. So we interview the team beforehand and find out how they feel about their manager and all the rest of it. And we interview the other team beforehand and we compare them. We find actually their attitudes to the managers are the same. So we know then that if we run an intervention in one of the places, we know that it's not the attitude towards the manager that's changed it. It's actually the intervention that's changed it. So we can start to run these sort of little experiments. You know, we can start to understand better the effects of these interventions over time, because hopefully we're going to be with that organisation. The managers are learning, the individuals are learning about what works and what doesn't work, because we're creating those conversations. Maybe you even get those two teams together and start talking to each other about what worked and what didn't work. So when they run the intervention, they run it better than the other team. So we create sort of communities of practice that can start talking about, how to change. And you sort of minimise ethical issues as well, because you're not doing laboratory experiments, or you're not giving someone a bonus and somebody else not a bonus to see what happens. You're using opportunities within the organisation. So if you've got a new manager coming into a team, you could do a before and after to see whether that manager's had impact and the competencies that you use to recruit that manager. You say, okay, well, if we recruit managers on this criteria, it seems to have a positive impact. Next time we recruit, let's see if the same thing happens. So one experiment is not going to give you the 100% causal claim. In fact, you'll never be 100% causal claim, because there's so many confounding factors. But what it does is it builds up a body of evidence in your own organisation about what works and what doesn't work, and gives you that confidence that when you're doing stuff, it is actually working or not, and then you can constantly tweak it. And it does give the opportunity as well for academics and practitioners to collaborate, because then you're going out to academics and saying, right, how do I set up a quasi-experiment in my organisation? I have no idea how to do it. And they'll help you, because they want to get access to the research, and the organisation learns how to do this stuff as well and test what works and what doesn't work. Yeah, this point about using the context to explain the organisation is what I've said. Explain the findings. What I've said is if something doesn't work, or if it does work, then you understand your organisation and the context, or you can try and normalise or run a survey to understand whether what other underlying confounding factors are making that thing work or not. So I thought, for me, this is a great practical approach for change practitioners to adopt, convince organisations, if you can, and you can see here that Adam Grant's talking about these steps, again, the same steps. What's the problem we're trying to solve? The hypothesis that we're trying to test. Where can I find, these variables occurring naturally, which is, okay, so what happens if we get rid of a certain manager from a group? Well, you don't have to do it and look unethical and look like you can wait, or there's an opportunity where they have recruited a manager to a group, and we can run a test there and say, okay, right, so what happened in that? So you don't necessarily, you use the natural life cycle of the organisation, I guess, to run experiments. If the hypothesis is supported, alternative explanation. So this is that sort of getting rid of confounding factors. So I just thought this was a nice model and reflects very well the evidence-based approach. And we need metrics, obviously. So the metrics that we have need to be in line with. They need to be able to measure the intervention, but they also need to be in line with what your strategic objective is as well. And obviously, the interventions should be aligned with the strategic objective. So the measures, when you go to manage and say, right, we're going to measure on this, they've got to be congruent. They've got to be tied into where the organisation's going. They've got to be connected to real improvements. And I think quasi-experiments help with that, because you're going to a manager or you're going to a group saying, look, if we trial this here, it could potentially solve your problem. So they're going to be more sold on it. And it's obviously contextualized the terrain. So if a manager says, well, that will never work here, we say, well, we've just tried it with Bob over in, you know, Manchester, and he was fine and it worked really well. So now we're going to do it in London. So and we're going to use these measures because we know, you know, so I think it really starts to create a dialogue, and we get the measures in place. And finally, I think that this approach, or evidence-based approach, is critical, underpins organisational change as well, because it gives organisations the agility, because they're learning about how their organisation works. The next time they face a challenge, they don't have to keep repeating stuff that doesn't work. They know what works, and they know what works in different contexts. So it makes them more agile. They can respond more quickly. It gives trust to leadership, and trust in leadership is core to organisational change as well. So people know why leaders are making decisions, because they're making decisions based on an evidence-based approach. And in fact, anybody can make a decision, because we all understand what the decision-making process is. And we know that organisational fairness, organisational justice is also critical to change. It empowers people, because it sort of cuts through the hierarchy, and anybody can start making decisions, which promotes efficacy and agency of individuals, which is so important to change as well. Sense of autonomy, sense of understanding what's going on around me, which is congruence. Lots of organisations talk about their values, talk about you know, diversity and inclusion, and people being treated as sort of individuals. And if people want to be treated as individuals, then they want their voice to be heard. And an evidence-based approach means their voice is heard, because we're listening to what's going on in the organisation. So it ties into you know, that whole sort of value structure within organisations as well. And yeah, I talked about fairness, objectivity, and transparency in decision making, and confidence as well. That if you've done it in Manchester and it worked, you go to the manager in London, it gives him confidence in you, that you know what you're talking about, and know more, maybe potentially more, about the way the organisation operates than he does, because, or she does, because they've never run an experiment before. So I think there's so much here that sort of creates that sort of that positive learning loop. So that's it really from me. I'm hoping that that's been provocative enough to create some debate. So I will now open the floor to everybody. So please contribute.